Okie dokie. Starting out with chapter 9. The chapters kind of go out of order and everything, but we're going to talk about the heart for this lecture. From here on out, we're going to do, or at least for the next couple of weeks, we're going to do quite a bit of heart stuff. The heart stuff in general is extremely important in understanding all of this to make your lives a lot easier later on down the road. You're going to see all of this heart stuff and like the process of the heart come back in Tri 3 with a handful of classes, as well as Tri 4 and Tri 5. And additionally, you're going to need to know the heart really, really well for a lot of reasons after this try. So if you learn the heart really well this trimester, during this chunk of time, you're going to be in a much, much, much better shape. So that is my heads up to you. You really want to know the heart well, understanding the flow of the blood, the anatomy of the heart, as well as kind of what happens when things go wrong in the heart. Okay? Okay. So talk about the heart function. So the function of the heart, the purpose we have it, is to provide the pressure to move blood. The heart is a pump. The heart is going to produce the pressure in order to move the blood through the blood vessels. Okay? So why do we need to move blood through the blood vessels? Hopefully this is a little bit obvious, but it's first of all to transport solutes to tissues. So we have to deliver the metabolic substrates to support cellular activity, and then we also have hormones and other chemical signals. When we talk about the solutes, think about stuff like oxygen, calcium, potassium, even the sodium. There's sodium in our blood as well. Basically, any of there's also a lot of the nutrients, or all of the nutrient stuff that we need are glucose, some of the components for proteins, all of that is moved through the blood. So we need to be able to get the blood to all the different parts of our body in order for the tissues to be healthy and to work properly. Okay. And then, of course, hormones and other chemical signals in order for the body to regulate itself. Additionally, removing cellular waste products, things like lactic acid, carbon dioxide are those big ones that we need to remove from the different parts of the body. So talking about cardiac muscle tissue, we touched on cardiac muscle tissue a little bit. The similarities with skeletal muscle, they are myofilaments and they're arranged into sarcomeres. Similarities they share with smooth muscle, they are involuntary, autorhythmic. They have those pacemaker cells. They're innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And they have a reduced sarcoplasmic reticulum, so smaller sarcoplasmic reticulum. The unique features of the cardiac tissue, they have intercalated discs. So in between the different cells of the cardiac cells, they have intercalated discs, so it's basically like an anchor filled with desmosomes. Desmosomes are what really kind of like the glue that holds all those the cells together. And then gap junctions. Gap junctions, we've talked about those, where our cells, they have these little openings like this to go into the next cell to connect, to allow the electrical signal to pass through freely in order to all communicate from one signal. All of the different muscle cells can contract simultaneously, or sort of in a pattern, kind of in a wave pattern, in order for the cell for the heart to beat properly. We have branched fibers, which is kind of like a Y-shaped and also very large T tubules. So remember, I called the cells Y-shaped. They are also, much like skeletal muscle, they are much like smooth muscle, they are cardiac muscle is either single nucleated or it can have two nuclei as well. Okay, so heart anatomy. You need to know the heart anatomy. In case my little spiel earlier was not you did not hear that. You need to know the heart anatomy for many, 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 many reasons from here on out. So one of the next most difficult classes, differential diagnosis, will require a ton of heart understanding that starts here. If you understand the heart here, you will be in a much better spot further on down the road. Okay, so we have the heart anatomy. Do we cover blood flow? Kind of. I'm going to go over blood flow right now because I want you guys to really start seeing it. So we're going to kind of go over the whole heart anatomy here and then go through each of these individual slides. So right in here, we have the inferior and the superior vena cava, or cava, however you want to pronounce it. Doesn't matter. Give me 1 second. The baby isn't crying, the cats are screaming. Okay. We have the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Their job is, well, I should define something really quick. First, veins bring blood back to the heart. Arteries bring blood away from the heart. This is very, very important concept. We'll get to exactly why in a moment. So the superior vena cava, coming from pretty much from the head, the neck, this whole area, coming down into everything else, arms, kind of this whole upper portion, feeds into that superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is everything, lower extremities, intestines, guts, all of that coming up, and both of them dump into the right atrium. Okay, we start on the right side of the heart. From the right atrium, well, the important thing to note about the right atrium, that this is where the SA node is located. The SA node is known as the pacemaker of the heart. It is where you have a large density of those autorhythmic cells, those pacemaker cells. That will start the contraction of the heart. From the atria, the blood gets pushed into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. This can be called the tricuspid valve, or it can be called the right AV valve. They're AKAs of each other. It's saying the exact same thing. It's called tricuspid because these three things here, there are three cusps, three cusps. Good thing to remember is that on the right side of your body, there are three for the heart and the lung. So the lung, there are 3 lobes of the right lung, 2 lobes of the left. 3 cusps of the valve on the right side, 2 cusps on the left side. Okay, so right side has 3. Okay, so it goes into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to get pushed through the pulmonary semilunar valve. The pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary is lungs, semilunar because it looks like a half moon, and a valve because it's a valve. This gets pushed the blood through the lungs, or to the lungs to get oxygenated. This right here, these pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body which carry deoxygenated blood. Okay? Promise you that will be a test question at some point, somewhere. The pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body that carry unoxygenated blood. Then the pulmonary veins, again, remember, veins bring blood back to the heart. Pulmonary veins are the only veins that are going to carry oxygenated blood. Okay? Remember those 2 things, because at some point you will be asked test questions about that. If not in this class, you will in a future class, I promise. Okay. So it goes up through this pulmonary semilunar valve, goes into the lungs, and then from the lungs, it goes back through the pulmonary veins, and then into the left atrium. The left atrium. From the left atrium, it goes through the cusp of the left AV valve, or the bicuspid valve, remember bi meaning two, and gets into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it gets squeezed up the ascending aorta, and then up through all of our different arteries, and then through the descending aorta down into the rest of the body. That is the flow of blood. You need to be able to write out that entire process step by step from memory very quickly. Practice that. I promise you, you will need it. More heart anatomy. So from the most superficial layer to the deepest layer, we have our epicardium. Then we have a myocardium, which is all of our muscle, and then endocardium, which is a simple squamous epithelium. Yep. That's pretty much, there's not a lot here. Excuse me. You should remember the different layers. Don't get epi and endo mixed up. Epi is the outside, endo is the deepest in the inside. Continue with heart anatomy. Surrounding the heart. If you haven't already seen this in your gross anatomy lab, you probably will soon. The surrounding the heart is like this fibrous tissue. It's called a fibrous pericardium. It's really tough to have to get through it. And that's really just wrapping around the heart, keeping it in place and also protecting it. But because the heart is a muscle and the muscle is constantly moving, when a muscle is active, what does it produce? It produces heat, especially if it's rubbing against other things. So we have these different layer systems in place, and as well as this fluid in there, to prevent too much friction from occurring. So we have our fibrous pericardium on the outside, and then we have a serous membrane is what it's called. And there's multiple layers. There's a visceral layer, which is in contact with the organ, which is in contact with the heart surface itself, that epicardium. And the parietal layer, which is in contact with the fibrous tissue. And then between those two, there's a pericardial fluid, also known as a serous fluid, that lowers the friction generated as the heart contracts and it pumps and it moves. This is a little addition here. So when there's inflammation or infection of the heart, there's going to be excess friction, which is what you'll get what you call a pericardial rub. You'll learn in future classes what that sounds like and how to listen for it and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, understand the layers, understand what's the purpose of the serous fluid. Okay, so the heart anatomy, again, need to know. Please, please, please know your anatomy of the heart. So the right side of the heart, the right atrium, we're going to go over this again. It receives blood from the vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava. It delivers blood to the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. From the right ventricle, it receives blood from the right atrium. It pumps blood to the lungs through the pulmonary semilunar valve. And we have two of those semilunar valves. We have a pulmonary and an aortic. And then it goes into the pulmonary trunk. This is the pulmonary trunk, which then the pulmonary trunk right here, which then goes into our left and right pulmonary arteries. Left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary veins, delivers blood to the left ventricle through the mitral or the bicuspid valve. There's another name for the left one. The left is mitral valve or bicuspid valve or left AV valve. The right is the tricuspid valve or the right AV valve. Remember those names because you will see them written every single way. Left ventricle receives blood from the left atrium through the aortic semilunar valve into the aortic trunk, pulmonary arteries, through the body, and return to the right side of the heart. Goes into the aortic. I think there's a typo here. I'm going to get rid of that. Goes into the aortic trunk. Oh, no, I know why that's written there. Pulmonary arteries. Because this is also, later on we'll talk about the lungs. And say the heart needs to feed the lungs too. So the heart is going to pump blood into arteries of the lungs, so that it flows up into the lungs in order to oxygenate the tissue itself for the lungs, and to give the lungs themselves the nutrients that it needs. It's going to go through the body and eventually turn to the right side of the heart through either the inferior or the superior vena cava. Okay, so we talk about the heart. We talk about the heart works in syncytium. So this is syncytium. The definition of this is a single cell or cytoplasmic mass containing several nuclei formed by fusion of cells or by division of nuclei. So in other words, it's kind of like the heart is synced together. It's a network of electrically connected cardiac muscle cells, which creates a functional unit of contraction called the syncytium. So with atrial syncytium, the atrial cells are attached via gap junctions. They allow electrical impulses to propagate between cells, and they act as a single unit. The ventricular syncytium, ventricular cells are attached via gap junctions. They allow electrical impulses to propagate between cells, and they act as a single unit. Something, I don't know if it talks about it here. It mentions it. We'll talk about the fibroskeleton. So when we talk about the heart working in syncytium, so why do the atria and the ventricles work independently of each other? So this is because the atria and the ventricles are separated by a fibrous skeleton right here. This fibrous skeleton is designed to separate the atria from the ventricles. And a big reason of that is if you ever listen to a heartbeat, you'll notice that the heart, there's almost like two sounds. It's bub bub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. Those two main sounds that you're hearing, one is caused by the atria, one is caused by the atria finishing its job, and the other sound, and the other dub is caused by the ventricles squeezing and finishing their job. Not by the ventricles squeezing, it's due to the valves themselves shutting after performing their jobs. But the way that the blood flow works, the atria both squeeze first in order to push the blood into the ventricles, and then the ventricles squeeze and push the blood out, and then the atria squeeze, and the ventricle squeeze, the atria squeeze, the ventricle squeeze, kind of like this. So that way it's lub, dub, lub, dub, lub, dub. So they need to act a little bit separate from each other, and to make sure that they work separately, but they also work together in order to pump the blood effectively. Okay. That's what we say, that these gap junctions are absent in the fibrous skeleton, meaning that they don't cross through. We do have this thing that connects them called the AV node, which when we get into more of like the electrical signaling of stuff, we'll talk about the AV node. That's how we start in the SA node, located where again? The right atria. And then that starts where the electrical signal first generates, and then it's going to go through the different tissue of the atria, of both of the atria, and eventually come to a point where there's a spot in the fibrous skeleton which will allow the signal to go through, called the AV node. And from the AV node, it'll pass into the ventricles. And we'll get into the kind of the in-depth portion of that when we start talking about the electricity of the heart and how we measure all of that. Okay, so up to this point right here, this is where exam 1 content ends, right here, according to this professor. So again, if you have a different professor, or you are just watching this back to recap, you will again continue. All of this other material should be kind of new type material. I'm gonna go ahead and stop this video right now, and this will be labeled the anatomy of the heart, and then we will jump into the next portion. Just that way it keeps this nice and organized.